Welcome again. This lecture is about structuralism. Structuralism as a literary theory and as a method. Simply speaking, structuralism is a practice when any time we, instead of looking at the individual sentence or a text or a word, refer to the larger structure within which that sentence, that word, or that term is posited, and where we decide that the knowledge of the structure is absolutely necessary to understand the individual utterance, the individual sentence, or the individual statement. And that's roughly how it applies to literary theory. Now think of it this way. You, me, and everyone else always usually thinks like a structuralist. Anytime someone says something, someone does something, to understand their words, to understand their behavior, we posit it within the larger structure of our knowledge of them, and only then can they make sense to us. How does it enter literary theory is a very interesting story, because it enters literary theory because of the work of a scholar who never really published the work that revolutionizes linguistics. And his name is Ferdinand Saussure. So Saussure was a linguist, and he taught a course which was called Course on General Linguistics. But he never published it, and some of his students published the work after Saussure's death. And Course on General Linguistics then becomes an important text for the linguistic structuralism and eventually structuralist movement. Now, what did Saussure discuss in his book? How did he revolutionize study of languages? So his first assertion was that we should not study languages diachronically, but rather synchronically. What do these two big words mean? So D, depth. So diachronically, what he means is that traditionally in linguistics, people had studied languages historically from their origins to their present to understand a language. By synchronically studying languages, what he meant was to study the language system as it exists within a given society. So that was the first assertion he makes, that we should study languages as they exist, as a system of signs. Then he goes on to define the sign itself. For Saussure, the sign wasn't a symbol of something, right? So he suggests, number one, that the sign has two parts to it, the signifier and the signified. Now think of it this way. The signifier is the acoustic sound that I am making or that you make, or something that we scribble down. That's the signifier. The signified is the concept that forms in our mind when someone uses a sign. For example, book. The moment I said book, a concept emerged in your mind. That concept is the signified. B-O-O-K, book, is the signifier. And the third term, which is also important, is the referent. What is the sign referring to in the real world? So book, any book that I pick up, is the referent. But most of the times it's the signifier and the signified. Now the relationship between the signifier and signified is like a page, right? There are two sides to it, but it can't really be split. The second thing that he asserts then is that the relationship between the signifier and the signified is completely arbitrary. It's not natural. There is no natural meaning when I say the word book. It is conventionally decided within a living linguistic society that when I use this sign, when I say book, this thing comes to your mind. So that relationship between the sign and what it refers to is completely arbitrary, but it gets fixed after it is generally accepted. And the third thing that he posits is that when we put these signs in a chain one after the other, they form a semiological chain. And meaning is understood through difference. Difference of what kind? Difference of one sign from the other. For example, if I say dog, the dog is a dog because it's not a cat. If I say table, a table is a table in difference to things around it, the chair, right? So let me repeat that. The sign has two sides to it, the signifier and the signified, and both of them combined together refer to something which is called a referent. That signs work through differences. Most of the times the difference can be a binary opposition, man, woman, civilized, uncivilized, and we'll get into the discussion of that in our lecture on post-structuralism, and that when signs are placed one next to the other, they form a semiological chain, right? But the most crucial thing that we learn is that we study these signs not as individual signs, but within the larger structure of language within which they are posited. Because if we don't know the structure, we will not know what the sign means. Okay, so that takes us to two other important terms that Saussure theorizes: langue and parole. Langue is the system of language within which we use signs. Parole is the individual utterance. And the individual utterance, what I say or you write in a sentence, becomes legible, becomes understandable only if we understand the system within which, or structure within which it is posited. And that's the beginning of structuralist thought. What happens because of that? So people then stop dwelling on the sentence structure, what the new critics were doing, or the similes or metaphors, and they started looking at the larger structures within which the sentences are made and see how they make sense within that larger structure. A great example of that is the work of Vladimir Prop, who was a formalist but also a structuralist. Now, in order to understand narrative techniques, structural narrative techniques, he and his colleagues go and collect about 3,000 folk tales. And when they read them, they realize that if they just read each individual story as an individual utterance, it doesn't make sense. But if they categorize them according to a system, they could basically tell all the world's stories in 36 structures. And within that, they could also predict the functions of different characters. Let me give you an example, the Cinderella story. The original, what we know of the Cinderella story, is of this young woman who is an orphan living with two sisters, eventually meets the happy prince, has a fairy godmother, and eventually escapes her poverty. Excuse me. Now, if we just read it as an individual standalone story, maybe it's just unique, but think of how many other Cinderella stories are there in the world. Anytime someone claims to have risen from poverty and made it into a successful person, that's a Cinderella story. Pretty Woman is a Cinderella story. Made in Manhattan is a Cinderella story. So that's what structuralism does. Another important figure in structuralist movement is Roland Barthes, a French theorist and scholar. And towards the end of his career, he starts writing about, everyday things, not necessarily literature, wrestling matches, games. And what he's arguing there is that in order to understand a wrestling match, for example, the individual actions, if they were just offered to anyone who doesn't know the structure of the game, would mean nothing. In order to understand what was permissible, what was not permissible in the game, they had to know what the structure of the game was. And it is that structure that allows a person to understand what actually is going on, not the individual actions of the wrestlers. I'll give you an example from my own personal life. I grew up in a culture where we watched soccer. which has different rules, a different legal structure. But when I came to America and my friends invited me to, come and watch the Super Bowl with them, I could not understand it. And the reason I didn't understand it was that the game whose structure I was applying there, in that game, if you hit an opponent, that was a foul. But here, most of the game was hitting your opponents. So the only way I could understand that was if I knew the structure of the game. So how do we apply this knowledge of linguistics to literary texts? When we do literary scholarship from a structuralist point of view, we don't dwell on what individual characters are saying. We probably will look for character types, right? We will look for the structure of the story. How does it begin? What's its middle? How does it end? What kind of mechanics are used by the author to take us from one point to the other? All the references will be to the structuralist or structural aspects of the story, and only that structure will then lend meanings to the individual actions of the characters. This is the simplest way in which we can understand structuralism. Okay, so let's say, to conclude, basically most of the critical thought developed in literary studies relies on the early work of Saussure and his work on linguistics and his insistence on the primacy and importance of the structure over individual utterance. When it gets adapted into literary studies, the scholars who work structurally then pay more attention to the larger structures within a story. Generic structures, is this a novel, is this a poem, and then evaluate a poem according to the structure which sustains it. And the individual words and individual sentences lose their primacy, their importance that they had in new criticism. Right? So that's roughly my understanding of structuralism. I will, of course, post more links to readings and other materials that can enhance your understanding of Saussure and people who followed him, like Roman Jakobson and others, and also of structuralist movement itself. I hope this was useful, and I hope it enables you to learn more about literary studies. Now, an important thing that I had promised you all was that I will also point out how these theories can be useful in real life. So, think of it, if you are working for any company, someone gives you a report, right, to read. There are different ways of reading it. If you just do line editing and check the commas and the words, you are being a new critic. You're fixing the problems on the sentence structure about right use of words, right? But if you think like a structuralist, you will first ask yourself, what kind of a document is it? Is it a legal document? If it is, what specific kind of legal document? It might have a format which is pre-decided. Then you'll be reading the text closely, but also you'll be editing it or revising it with reference to that structure. You will be a structuralist, and you will declare a document successful only if it adheres to all the structural demands of that particular piece of legal document. So that's one of the practical uses of structuralism in life. There are other theorists as well. Early Michel Foucault is also a structuralist, and quite a few others, and I will certainly post links to them. But in this lecture, right now, this is all I have on structuralism, and I hope it was helpful to you. And thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you next time.